All right, well, as folks continue to filter in, we're going to get started. So welcome, my name's Marika Azoff. I'm the Corporate Engagement Specialist at the Good Food Institute, and welcome to our webinar focused on alternative seafood. Go to the next slide. So today's webinar is based on the newly published Alternative Seafood Industry Update. If you haven't read the report yet, we'll pop it in the chat. Thanks, Molly. Highly recommend taking a look at it. And today, myself and Dr. Claire Baumkamp and I will dive into the alternative seafood commercial landscape. We'll cover investments in alt seafood, plant-based seafood, US retail sales. We have a bonus section, one that's not even in the report. We have Dr. Claire Baumkamp, our cultivated seafood and meat senior scientist here to provide an alternative seafood science and technology overview. And this webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. So if you're joining us live, we really recommend that you join our speed networking session after the event. It's a ton of fun, low pressure. You can even decide who you'd like to be matched with. And we're gonna post a link to that in the chat if you haven't signed up already for that networking session. And we will also have time for questions at the end of today's webinar. So please make sure you're posting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than in the chat. But in the chat, feel free to chime in with where you're tuning in from. If you have specific interests in any area or something else to add to this presentation, we'd love to hear from you. You can go to the next slide. Oh, you're there already. Thank you. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Good Food Institute or GFI, we're a nonprofit that works to develop the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. And we work across the areas of science and technology, corporate engagement, and policy. And we really work to accelerate innovation in alternative proteins like plant-based and cultivated seafood. We have over 130 staff in 6 different regions around the world, and we're continuing to rapidly grow. And we're funded entirely philanthropically. So if you find the insights and resources that we provide useful, please do consider making a donation. And if you're already part of our family of generous donors, thank you so much for making our work possible. So our current meat, seafood, and egg and dairy production is unsustainable and inefficient. And with the global population growing to 10 billion by 2050, demand for seafood, meat, eggs, and dairy really shows no signs of stopping. So instead of asking consumers to give up the products they love, our way of kind of tackling these huge challenges that we face is to focus on harnessing technology to make these products in a way that doesn't contribute to environmental degradation or that aren't a public health risk. And our webinar today is the third in a series that's based on GFI's annual State of the Industry reports. So if you haven't already, please sign up for our plant-based meat, seafood, eggs, and dairy webinar that's happening this Thursday. We'll post a link to that in the chat. And there's also a corresponding networking mixer after, similar to the one today. And if you'd like to help us make our reports and all of our resources as accurate as possible, please tell us about your company by joining our company database. And we'll post a link in the chat as well. So without further ado, let's talk about seafood, alternative seafood. What is it? When I use the term alternative seafood, what am I referring to? So the term refers to seafood produced using one or more of these three production methods. So first we have plant-based. And plant-based seafood products are created using plant-derived ingredients to really replicate the flavor and texture of conventional seafood. We can use advanced food science techniques, and companies are really able to break down conventional seafood products into their most basic components and to use plant ingredients to build pretty much identical products. And then producing alternative seafood through fermentation involves the cultivation of any microbial species to produce either a whole cell biomass or alternative seafood ingredients. And lastly, we have cultivated seafood, which is produced directly from fish or shellfish cells. The process of cultivating seafood uses basic elements needed to build muscle and fat and enables the same biological processes that happen inside an animal to occur in a bioreactor, which essentially looks like a large brew tank. And cultivated seafood is identical to conventional seafood at the cellular and molecular level. So why does alternative seafood matter? Well, several trends such as population increase, a rise and projected rise in seafood consumption, and the unsustainable overfishing of our oceans all drive the need for alternative seafood. So this graph from the World Resources Institute shows the trend and predicted trends of conventional seafood. So the bottom half shows wild-caught fisheries, and wild seafood catch rates have been pretty much stagnant since about 1990, and you can see that here in the graph, and they're projected to decline in the coming decades. The Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO, estimates that only 6% of global fish stocks are underfished, 60% are maximally fished. So that means that we're catching as much fish as possible without reducing fish populations below the most productive level. And 34% are overfished, meaning that the fish are caught faster than the populations can reproduce. Then we have the aquaculture industry, which has really grown to try to keep up with demand over the past several decades. But projections show that growth slowing based on some industry-related challenges. And currently, aquaculture makes up the majority of the world's seafood supply, but it's still dependent on the conventional industry. So 11% of wild-caught seafood is used for fish feed in aquaculture, and 5% is used as livestock feed. So that's where alternative seafood comes in. Alternative seafood gives us the opportunity to diversify and supplement the total global supply of seafood. It offers new forms of seafood production to help meet the growing demand, and it's largely an untapped market white space. So I could really spend an entire webinar discussing the various environmental, economic, social, and welfare related benefits of alternative seafood, but I've just listed a couple here. So to start, thank you. Alternative seafood doesn't need to be produced near water. It can be produced in the middle of the country in a landlocked area. And some of the potential benefits of this include cheaper transportation and refrigeration costs, fewer incidents of spoilage, and that's a huge issue that the conventional industry faces. And with seafood, conventional seafood is often more expensive than some widely consumed terrestrial meat like chicken. So therefore, there's an opportunity for alternative seafood to reach price parity with certain species of conventional seafood more quickly. The conventional industry faces, can be volatile and faces challenges of inconsistent supply, and we've seen that during the COVID-19 pandemic. And alternative seafood can be produced in response to demand and therefore can better withstand supply and demand shocks such as global pandemics. And then lastly, seafood is often consumed because of its health benefits, as conventional seafood is. And alternative seafood producers can add protein and omega-3s to their alternative seafood products. And they can also add other nutrients to make these products nutritionally superior to their conventional counterparts. And that's definitely not to say that there aren't immense challenges in sourcing ingredients and formulating products to reach nutritional and taste parity, but a lot of companies are prioritizing nutritional health in their alternatives. So if you'd like to learn more about the benefits of alternative seafood, you can check out our Ocean of Opportunity white paper, and we'll post that in the link in the chat as well. So this slide is from consumer research that we commissioned in 2020 to better understand what consumers are looking for in an alternative seafood product in the US. So these turf analyses demonstrate ideal messaging to reach the maximum number of consumers. And you can see that the results for plant-based and cultivated are very similar. So in both cases, taste is table stakes, and messaging about products' environmental, health, and more functional benefits can bring additional consumers into the category, but only after taste messaging is achieved. So now I'm going to dive into the 2021 alternative seafood commercial landscape. And according to our database, at the end of 2021, there were at least 120 companies developing alternative seafood, with at least 21 new companies entering the space in 2021. So thus far, plant-based seafood has really dominated the alternative seafood category. but 9 new companies, which is almost half of all of the new alternative seafood companies in 2021, were focused on cultivated seafood. You can go to the next slide. So this slide shows kind of a geographic breakdown of where the companies developing alternative seafood are located. And as you can see, the majority is produced in Europe and North America, with Asia Pacific not far behind. And in 2021, we saw the first launches of alternative seafood companies in Estonia, South Africa, Latvia, Australia, and Israel. But these numbers on the left hand of this slide don't correspond with the geographic breakdown of where the majority of conventional seafood is produced. So the top 3 seafood producing countries are in the Asia Pacific region, followed by North America and then Latin America. So one could really argue a need for more alternative seafood companies in these regions where conventional seafood production is highest. And 2021 was filled with a lot of exciting company, product, and facility launches. So while I can't highlight all of them here in this next section, I'm just going to highlight 1 or 2 from each region. So the Brazilian company, and excuse me, I will definitely, for lack of a better word, butcher some of these pronunciations, but I will do my best. Fazenda Futuro, or Future Farm, is a Brazilian company known best for its meat alternatives. And they, in 2021, expanded into alternative seafood with a plant-based tuna product called Future Tuna. This is a shelf-stable tuna product made with soy and pea proteins and contains algal omega-3s. In Hong Kong, Green Monday's food tech business Omni Foods expanded into plant-based seafood and now produces 6 seafood products, 2 different fish fillets, an ocean burger, salmon, shelf-stable tuna, and crab cakes. The products are high in protein, they have omega-3 fatty acids, and they're available in food service and retail around the world. And last November, Starbucks Hong Kong added Omni's plant-based crab cakes to their menu. Israel really won the gold medal for the country with the most new companies developing alternative seafood. So there are 5 new companies launched in Israel focused on alternative seafood, and 4 of the 5 were focused on cultivated seafood, and that's Force Seafoods, Sea2Sell, Wanda Fish, and Efficient Protein. And I very much appreciate all fish puns and these creative names. And the fifth company was Plantish, which is a plant-based company. And outside of just seafood, Israeli investments in cultivated meat and seafood in general accounted for more than 1/3 of all investments into cultivated meat and seafood. So for such a small country, there's a lot of growth and innovation there. And Africa's first cultivated seafood company, Systematic, launched in South Africa last year. Some other companies in South Africa that are working on cultivated meat include Msansi Meat and most recently Mohali Meat. And in the US, the cultivated salmon company Wildtype opened a facility that's serving as kind of part plant, part tasting room, and part educational center. They plan to launch first in food service and eventually in retail pending regulatory approval. And I'll talk about some of their exciting partnerships in the next few minutes. And then we have Finless Foods, which expanded their portfolio to include plant-based tuna. So Finless initially was focused on cultivated bluefin tuna, and they developed this plant-based product during the process of developing their cultivated one and decided to bring it to market first. So that should be launching sometime this year. In Europe, Caravella is one of the largest canned fish producers in Europe, and they launched a plant-based canned seafood line called Fish Peas. And this line includes a range of fish flakes, salads, and spreads. And Nestle launched its second plant-based seafood product last year. It launched a plant-based shrimp called Vrimp, made from seaweed and peas. And last year, or in 2020, they had launched Vuna, which is a plant-based tuna. Bird's Eye's plant-based brand Green Cuisine added fish fingers to their plant-based meat repertoire. And these products contain rice protein as well as omega-3s. And in Thailand, the conventional seafood giant Thai Union continued to be an active player in the alternative protein space. So in addition to offering contract manufacturing for private labeling, They also launched OMG Meat, which is a range of plant-based seafood and meat products in Thailand. Then lastly, the cultivated crustacean company Shiok Meats has headquarters both in Hong Kong and Singapore. And in 2021, they opened a pilot R&D plant at their headquarters in Singapore. And the official opening of the plant was initiated by Miss Grace Fu, who's Singapore's Minister for Sustainability and the Environment. And in her speech, she praised innovation, the innovation of alternative protein companies, and is really an alternative protein champion. So it's one thing for all of these new companies to launch, but it's also important to highlight how they're reaching consumers. So this slide shows some of 2021's most significant distribution deals, but is by no means comprehensive. And in the next few slides, I'm going to highlight a few of these. So the US-based Aquaculture Foods is a company that uses microbial fermentation to produce whole-cut seafood products. They're developing a range of products, and they've announced that the first product they'll bring to market will be calamari. In October, Aquaculture Foods raised $2.1 million in an oversubscribed pre-seed round and announced that they plan to launch, their market launch is planned for 2022. They partnered with Migros, which is Switzerland's largest retailer, to speed up their product development. And partnerships such as these are really incredibly valuable for companies that are pre-launch, as they have immense potential to help them overcome some of the most challenging scaling hurdles, such as manufacturing or ingredient sourcing. Then we have California-based Wildtype Foods that I spoke about a little bit earlier, focused on cultivated salmon. And last year, they announced pre-launch distribution agreements with Snow Fox and Pokeworks. So Snow Fox operates sushi bars at over 1,000 grocery locations across the United States. And Pokeworks is a rapidly growing fast casual chain that has 65 locations currently. And these partnerships will ultimately allow consumers to sample Wildtype's sushi grade cultivated salmon for the first time. But as I mentioned, Wildtype will need to first achieve get regulatory approval from the FDA before market launch is possible, as is the case with all of these cultivated seafood companies, except for the ones in Singapore. And I'd love to mention that earlier this year in 2022, Wildtype raised $100 million in a Series B funding round. That was the largest round ever raised by a cultivated seafood company to date. In addition to distribution deals, strategic partnerships are also really powerful ways of leveraging different companies' expertise to create mutually beneficial partnerships. So in the following slides, I'll zoom into two examples from this. So first we have cultivated seafood company Blue Nalu in California, and they're working on several different species, including mahi-mahi and bluefin tuna. And last year they signed memorandums of understanding with Thai Union and Mitsubishi. And these agreements were really designed to assess market development strategies for Blue Nalu's cultivated seafood in Asia. They also began working with Nomad Foods, which is a leading frozen food company in Europe. And this agreement will allow the two companies to explore the introduction of cultivated seafood in Europe. Hong Kong-based seafood company Avant Meats formed several strategic partnerships last year. They're focused on developing cultivated fish maw, fish fillets, and beauty products. And last year, they formed a strategic partnership with Vinhoan Corporation, VHC, which is the world's largest conventional Pangaseous, I always mispronounce that word, Pangaseous company, or Pangaseous. My apologies for the mispronunciation. And this partnership will support Avant Meat's development and commercialization while diversifying VHC's product portfolio to appeal to a broader consumer base. And Avant Meats also partnered with the Chinese biopharmaceutical company Quacell to help bring the cost of their animal-free cell culture media down. Additionally, they set up a joint research lab in Singapore with the Agency for Science, Technology, and Research Bioprocessing Technology Institute. And this partnership focuses on scaling up production of Avant's cultivated fish maw and fish fillets. And lastly, they announced a new research and development pilot production facility in Singapore, which was supported by the Singapore Economic Board. So since the industry's inception, the cultivated industry's inception, different companies in the media have really used a wide variety of terms to refer to the same thing, which is cultivating animal or fish or shellfish meat produced by cultivating the cells directly. So multiple consumer studies and corporate surveys have assessed consumer response on industry nomenclature, and the data is pointing to a few terms that are rising to the top. So on this slide, I showed the results from a 2021 GFI poll of 44 companies focused on this technology, and it found that 75% of the companies prefer the term cultivated. And this represents a shift from the 2020 numbers, which were a little bit more distributed across the different terms. And last year, or in 2020, those cultivated was only used 37% of the time, also followed by cultured at 25%. And of those 44 companies that participated in the survey, 7 of them were focused on cultivated seafood. So I calculated the percentages for those companies on the right hand here, and you can see that cultivated is still the most widely used term. Cell cultured comes in second, followed by cell-based. And you'll notice that the percentages don't add up to 100, and that's because we allowed companies to select multiple options. So now let's shift gears and take a look at 2021's alternative seafood investments. We saw record investments, nearly doubling the total investments in 2020 in alternative seafood. Alternative seafood companies raised $175 million of invested capital across 15 deals with disclosed deal sizes. And that brings the total investments in alternative seafood from 2013 to 2021 to $313 million. And the sizes of 9 deals in 2021 were not disclosed. So while this growth is in investment numbers is really impressive and encouraging, it's also important to note that this is largely due to a few really significant raises. In 2021, we saw 1 Series A round and 2 Series B rounds in the space. There were also 108 unique investors in 2021, including a couple venture arms of conventional seafood companies and investors who have traditionally focused on investing in conventional seafood. The largest sum raised in 2021 was Blue Nalu's $60 million of convertible debt financing. The second largest amount raised was that of cultivated and plant-based seafood company Finless Foods, which raised $34 million in Series B funding. And the third largest raise came from the plant-based company Gathered Foods that makes Good Catch, and they raised $26.35 million in a B2 bridge funding round. Some of you may have already tuned into our webinar with SPINS and the Plant-Based Foods Association that covered the 2021 US retail market data for the plant-based industry. And if you haven't read that report or watched that webinar, highly recommend doing so. We'll put the link to the report in the chat. So in the US, plant-based seafood retail increased by 14% in 2021 and 42% in the past 2 years. Plant-based shellfish sales grew by 30% and plant-based fish sales grew by 9%. And in terms of dollar sales, plant-based fish composed about 75% of the plant-based seafood market, while plant-based shellfish makes up the other quarter. And additionally, the number of plant-based seafood products on retail shelves is also increasing. So in 2020, only 32 plant-based seafood products were sold in US retail. In 2021, 8 new plant-based seafood products made it to the shelves, growing the product by 25% last year. And in contrast, more developed categories such as plant-based meats, that they have hundreds of SKUs in the marketplace. There are more options at different price points, merchandised across different departments. So plant-based seafood remains a really small fraction of the overall plant-based meat and seafood category and accounts for less than 1% of dollar sales, whereas conventional seafood composes of composes 20% of total conventional meat and seafood sales. So plant-based seafood still represents a significant white space, as I mentioned earlier. We like to frame things in terms of opportunity because that's what this is. And alternative seafood is well positioned to capitalize on the momentum of the rest of the plant-based industry, which is continuing to see a lot of innovation and growth. So at a starting point, to help us quantify this opportunity, we can look at where plant-based meat is today. So plant-based meat makes up 1.4% of the dollar share amount of all meat products in the United States, meaning all conventional and conventional animal-based meat as well as plant-based meat. So compared to plant-based meat's 1.4%, plant-based seafood only makes up about 0.1% of the dollar share amount of all seafood products sold in the US, which is a $15 billion industry. So just to start, by increasing the dollar share amount of seafood by 1.3% so that it's on par with where plant-based meat is today, we're looking at a $220 million opportunity. And it's important to note that 65% of seafood purchases in the United States are made away from home in food service. So this opportunity is many times larger when we factor in restaurant and food service sales. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Claire Baumkamp to discuss alternative seafood science and technology developments.
Thanks so much, Marika. So I'm just going to be giving a really quick snapshot of some of the most exciting things that happened in cultivated seafood or alternative seafood science and technology in the past year. So one thing that really stuck out to me as a highlight was the expansion in the number of research projects that GFI was able to fund related to alternative seafood. So on the cultivated seafood side of things, we've funded projects on cell line development, culture media, and scaffolding. And as of 2021, we now have 2 groups of grantees working on plant-based seafood. And then we also funded a small project related to end product characterization to sort of give a really clear target for what are the attributes that these products should be trying to hit, regardless of any of the 3 platforms that companies are using for production. Next slide, please. So beyond just the project view of this, I really wanted to highlight the people involved in making this research happen and what it looks like to be part of and to build a collaborative ecosystem of researchers who are talking to one another and building off of each other's ideas. So if we skip back to 2020, GFI at that point had funded 3 projects related to cultivated seafood. So on this slide, I'm just going to be talking about cultivated because that's kind of my personal area of interest. And so this was, really great early progress. And then in 2021, we expanded the projects we were funding by 4 additional research teams. And one thing that I thought was really cool about this new crop of projects was that out of these 4, 3 had collaborations actually with former GFI grantees. So the research teams we had funded in 2020 became collaborators on newer projects. And I really love to see this kind of collaboration across research teams. And so this is, really just talking about formal partnerships and formal collaborations related to cultivated seafood. But I think equally important are the informal connections between all of the labs and all of the research groups involved in this work. And so, that can look like anything from just very informally researchers bouncing ideas off of one another to, everything up to a formal collaboration. And so I think it's really those kinds of connections that are going to allow this research to be impactful in the future. And of course, we can't have the Kaplan Lab and the Avizipor Lab on one slide without talking about the National Institute for Cellular Agriculture, which was funded by the USDA for $10 million in 2021. And so this was a huge collaborative effort between several labs, including the Kaplan and Avizipor labs, who we are super just proud and honored to be able to count among our grantees. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of a few of the papers that I found exciting in 2021. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but just to say, you know, we're talking about everything from plant-based seafood to scaffolds made from seaweed, which could be used for seafood, for meat, for, you know, whatever end product you're talking about, but might have some particular advantages when it comes to seafood. And, you know, including also development of new cell lines that could be used for cultivated seafood, and development of technologies that can improve our ability to come up with low cost and effective sources of omega-3s, which are going to be needed as ingredients for alternative seafood from any production platform. Next slide. I also wanted to talk about our seafood related events. So we have a series of webinars that we run from time to time, which we call SWIM, for seafood webinars and informal mixers. And so these are just, you know, a couple of talks on a particular topic related to alt seafood, and then we pair that with a networking session. So this year we had 4 SWIM events. One on algae as it relates to alternative proteins, one on media optimization for cultivated seafood. Marika did a really excellent presentation in September on the alternative seafood industry. And then we had a session on the science of cultivated crustaceans. And one thing that I find really fun with these events is seeing the number of individual one-to-one connections that are made at the networking events between researchers, people at companies. And so, you know, any one of these connections can be something that that eventually blossoms into a bigger collaboration. And so it was really exciting across these 4. We saw 431 individual connections made. So that was a big highlight. Next slide, please. Also on the seafood events front, we had a few other events here and there throughout the year. So we had a networking and info session that was as we were gearing up for our competitive research grants for the year. And that was really a chance for people to meet collaborators and to meet with us to ask questions about that RFP. I should also mention we have another RFP that's out now if you want to join our network of grantees. And so at that event, we had 137 individual connections made. We also had a session on alternative seafood as it relates to ocean policy at the Good Food Conference. We had a couple of events as part of our Science of Alt Protein series featuring Dr. Reza Ovizipor and Michael Saad from the Kaplan Lab. And then in December, we had a session talking about some updates to our Atlas species prioritization tool. Next slide. A couple of other miscellaneous things that we got up to in 2021. We improved our resources related to cell lines. So we now have a database you can find on GFI's website where you can look at cell lines that are either that we know are available from one repository or another, or cell lines that have been published, and you know, you may or may not be able to get them by contacting the depositing researcher. And we're continuing to work to try to improve access through repositories, funding development of new cell lines, and whatnot. So cell lines are still an ongoing challenge, both in seafood and in terrestrial meat, but we are doing our best there. We also improved and added some visualization tools to our seafood archetype prioritization tool, Atlas. And so this is a tool for researchers, for companies, for investors, anyone kind of trying to make quantitative comparisons between, should I focus on cultivated salmon or cultivated tuna? And so really being able to put some numbers to everything from mercury concentration in conventional seafood to environmental sustainability to market size. And so that, along with the companion resource Pisces, which is a little bit more geared towards the science and technology side of things and categorizes data according to species rather than these larger sort of menu type categories that we refer to as archetypes. Those are both available on our website. The last thing I'll mention is our ASAP project, which is we kind of think of it as our ideas repository. So this is a database of white spaces in alternative protein that we really think are high leverage areas that somebody should really be, or maybe that some people are already working on, but where we think that there's really room for additional innovation. And so this is kind of our attempt to give a one-page outline of some ideas that we think need some additional attention. And so in 2021, we did a lot to add seafood related content to that resource. So you can check that out on our website as well. And with that, I think that's all I had. So I will hand it back to Marika.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Claire. I've noticed there are no questions in the Q&A box, maybe one or two in the chat. So please ask your questions. We have not only myself and Claire joining us for the Q&A, but we have some other GFIers with unique expertise. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. If not, we'll just assume that our presentation is 100% comprehensive. So most of the most plant-based seafood products available, I thought we were on the next slide. So no, you're good. It gets to go back to the other one. This presentation kind of as a whole, and the report that it's based on have really highlighted the alternative seafood industry's impressive growth, still within the context of its very small market size. So with a small but growing industry comes significant opportunities for new product development and innovation. And in this last section, I'm going to cover some of the opportunity areas within this sector. So the majority of plant-based seafood products available for purchase in the United States right now are either shelf-stable or they're frozen. But if we look at the global trends from 1962 to 2018 from the Food and Agriculture Industry in this graph, we see that the fresh and frozen fish and shellfish make up the majority of the seafood sold around the world, and that those segments are only continuing to grow. But in the US in 2021, there were 0 plant-based seafood dollar sales that came from the refrigerated section. And the category, the alternative seafood category in retail was really dominated by frozen products. I should note that if a product was sold in both the frozen and the refrigerated sections, it would probably be categorized as frozen for now. So we may be missing a few data points here. But we really see huge opportunity for companies to focus on refrigerated products in order to reach those consumers who buy fresh or chilled conventional seafood in the seafood section or at the seafood counter or in the refrigerated seafood section. So to help us better understand this opportunity, we can look at plant-based meat retail sales. And the types of products that are being shelved in the meat aisle are what we call the next generation of high fidelity products that are marketed to omnivores instead of just vegans and vegetarians. So we've seen refrigerated plant-based meat grow rapidly as a result of these high fidelity next generation products being placed in the meat aisles or the conventional meat section. And in the past 3 years, all 3 of these segments have continued to grow: refrigerated, frozen, and shelf stable. But the refrigerated section has been growing the fastest. We also, the number of products is also growing, but so is the number of households purchasing products. So for example, 2 years ago, only 7% of households were purchasing refrigerated plant-based meat products. And today, more than 10% of households are. And because there are many more aquatic animal species that are consumed than terrestrial ones, there are nearly endless opportunities to develop novel products to meet niche market needs around the world. And the photos on the right are of a recent vlog that GFI posted, in which I interviewed marine biologist and PhD student Vanessa Haley Benjamin, who's focused on developing cultivated mollusks, and specifically cultivated conch, which is a species of shellfish that's commonly consumed in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. And I highlight this because while I, sitting here in my apartment in New York, looking at seafood consumption rates, might not think to focus on cultivated conch, Vanessa, who comes from the Bahamas, where her community has been dependent upon the now dwindling supply of conch, has the unique perspective really needed to help develop a solution that can potentially support communities around the world whose diets are composed of this species. And we'll post the link to that blog post in the chat here. So, taste and texture are queen. I decided to use queen instead of king because I'm a feminist. And some of the taste and texture challenges that alternative seafood faces are unique. Some of them are also shared with the rest of the alternative protein world. And as we've seen in the consumer research that we conducted last year, it's incredibly necessary for alternative seafood products to taste really good, to achieve taste and texture parity with conventional seafood. And a lot of the ingredients that are currently used to produce alternative seafood are the same ones used to produce alternative meat or plant-based meat, and they can sometimes contain pretty significant off flavors. So conventional seafood tends to have very delicate flavors, and these off flavors from the plant-based proteins can compete with and overpower the seafood flavors. And because there are so many different types of seafood that taste different depending on the type of the species, the cooking method, the level of freshness, etc., it's also really hard to know what consumers look for in any given seafood alternative. So the industry really needs to conduct more sensory research to better understand the flavor and textural qualities that consumers value in specific seafood alternatives. And more investment in alternative seafood research and development will be key to help the industry better optimize ingredients and improve flavor solutions. And according to our consumer research, 69% of US consumers somewhat or extremely value nutritional content when deciding to eat seafood, and that's conventional and alternative seafood. So in order to appeal to health-conscious consumers, alternative seafood products should really contain similar protein levels and omega-3 fatty acids to conventional seafood. And at the moment, animal-free omega-3s, say that 10 times fast, can be really expensive. The supply can be inconsistent. And a lot of alternative seafood companies are purchasing supplemental grade omega-3s, which are usually sold at a premium. So it's more difficult to reach price parity with conventional seafood when these companies have to incorporate the omega-3s that they're using are sold at a premium. And additionally, in order to achieve the desired texture and taste of plant-based seafood specifically, nutrition is often sacrificed for taste and texture's sake, because some of the most commonly used ingredients for plant-based seafood don't contain protein. That based on our consumer research, that prioritizing taste and texture is definitely the way to go, but we also want to make sure that these products have really good nutritional content as well. So the industry needs to fund research on novel protein sources and increase investment to scale the ingredient supply chains. And also scaling up animal-free omega-3 production is really critical to the success of the alternative seafood market. So the takeaway from this presentation is really that the alternative seafood industry has seen exciting growth in 2021 across all of these three areas: investment, retail sales, the number of companies entering the space. But compared to the $401 billion global seafood industry, alternative seafood is still a really nascent category. And scaling the industry and reaching more consumers will require greater investment, improved production technologies, and capacity scaling, among other things. And accelerating the development and commercialization and widespread availability of alternative seafood will really help establish a future of food with responsible ownership of land and sea, while also feeding billions of people. So that concludes our portion of the presentation. We have a suite of amazing newsletters that I highly recommend you sign up for to stay up to date on the latest alternative protein news, and we'll post a link in the chat. We're now going to open up the floor for questions. We have our community engagement coordinator, Molly, who's been keeping track of. Now I do see questions in there. Let's see. Awesome. Thank you all. So she'll be moderating the Q&A. We also have other GFI experts on the line, including our corporate engagement project manager, Emma, and our senior investor engagement specialist, Sharon, and Claire and I as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Molly. And I'm also going to paste the networking link in the chat one more time. So we'd really love to see you all join that at the top of the next hour.
Great. Thank you, Marika. An excellent presentation, Marika and Claire. So first question is a good one. What needs to happen for the industry to reach that 1.4% of total seafood sales? What are the specific bottlenecks and limits to production at this point?
Awesome. Sorry, I'm like trying to find these questions so that I can follow along. There we go. To reach the 1.4%, there are many bottlenecks that face the general alternative protein industry. A lot of those are around manufacturing capacity, the availability of ingredients, the cost involved with production now is really at a premium. For alternative seafood specifically, I think we need more companies producing this in different regions around the world, and we need companies that are really prioritizing taste and texture as well as nutrition, and most of them are focused on that. But one of the reasons we don't fully understand why alternative seafood is a couple steps behind the rest of the alternative industry, but we could guess that it's due to the health halo that surrounds conventional seafood. So the need for alternatives might not have been realized as early as the need for alternatives for terrestrial meat was. So I think when I said that there's a real potential for alternative seafood to capitalize on the momentum of the rest of the industry, we really see that, and it's just that there have been fewer products on the market for less time. So as products continue to tackle some of these, or as companies continue to tackle some of the taste and textural hurdles and get those nutrients added into the products, I think we're going to see some significant growth. And also, if you'd like to learn more about kind of some of the scaling hurdles that the rest of the industry is facing, we can paste in the chat a link to a recent paper that will be helpful. And feel free to add anything else, those of you who are also on the Q&A.
Thank you, Marika. I would also just add, I think Marika articulated really well some of the sort of differences between alternative seafood and terrestrial alternative proteins with respect to the sort of specific consumer drivers and barriers. But I think a lot of the challenges are analogous to challenges that we're seeing across the alternative protein industry. One of those being manufacturing scale up. Contract manufacturing capacity is something that we talk about a lot. And then another significant bottleneck is talent, which is actually a nice segue into another question that we received here. So someone asked a comment on where in the sort of talent pipeline is the specific bottleneck and which opportunities currently exist for potentially, maybe someone's in school and they're wanting to know what they should study if they want to go in this industry, or if there are any sort of training programs out there where those talent bottlenecks are.
Awesome. I don't know if Claire, being from SciTech, you want to talk a little bit about that program, about our resources?
Sure. Yeah. I think this is a really great question. I think I would say maybe the biggest bottleneck is not so much a specific, set of training programs that doesn't exist. It's more having the right expertise kind of in the same in one person, basically. So, there's food science programs all over the place. There's tissue engineering programs all over the place. But what's really unique to cultivated seafood is, again, answering from the cultivated perspective, I can take a stab at plant-based too in a second, but we really need people who have both of those sorts of sets of knowledge. So, and that's not really something you would get out of any traditional degree program. And then on the plant-based side, it's maybe something more like agriculture and food science that we're not sort of bringing all those same ideas in the same room. And so I think we're starting to see certainly changes there. So we're starting to see courses specifically on alternative proteins, and majors even. So I think in a few years that situation will change. But I would say, yeah, it's more about kind of having the right sets of knowledge kind of brought together. We do have some resources for students who are interested in getting involved in this area. So I will dig up that link and paste it in the chat. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Great. I think we can move on to the next question. But yeah, if you are interested in working in this industry, GFI definitely has a lot of career resources you can take advantage from and explore more on our website. So next question here, are the large food processors and manufacturers embracing the market? And are they interested in supporting and funding projects here? So I know we covered a couple of the partnerships with some of the larger food manufacturers in this presentation, like Thai Union is one that comes to mind. JBS subsidiary Vivera just launched a plant-based seafood product in Europe that's actually at price parity with conventional seafood, which we're really excited about. I'm not sure. Nestle is another one. Just kind of thinking off the cuff here. I don't know if Marika, there are any additional ones you want to highlight here, but I will say, yeah, it seems to be that there's a bit of interest in this space for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Some more include Bumblebee Foods. I'm trying to remember more of the significant ones last year, but we're also seeing, like Molly said, companies that maybe don't focus as heavily on conventional meat, but more so on the unconventional seafood, but more so on conventional meat, also getting interested in the space because it's a way of kind of diversifying their offerings and entering the seafood space without needing to ramp up, start producing or supplying conventional seafood. Sharon, did you pop on to add something?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yes, I was just going to say that I think this is a trend that we see really across alternative proteins, that the large food and meat manufacturers are very much getting involved and quickly. So that's stemming both from the opportunities they see in the market, right? This really fast growing market and changing consumer preferences, and then also the risks that they see in potentially, becoming financially stranded assets over time as governments enact more sustainability oriented policies. Investors are demanding this as well. So it's really a win-win from the company from both a financial and business perspective, as well as a corporate social responsibility perspective. And we're seeing partnerships pop up everywhere. I think Blue Nalu just on their own have at least 5 or 6 or more than that at this point of various types of partnerships. And partnerships are a really nice way for these companies to get involved because it's more asset light. Some of them maybe don't want to engage in acquisitions, although some, as Molly pointed out with JBS's acquisition of Vivera, very much do. And it lets them leverage their distribution relationships, their manufacturing capabilities, their marketing talent, and more, while benefiting from the startups, innovation, and the research that they've done to get them where they are to date. So it's very much a strategy that these companies are getting involved with, alongside investing in companies and manufacturing their own products.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon. So a couple questions came through about regulatory policy and sort of what the challenges and opportunities are for regulatory policy for alternative seafood. So on the cultivated side, of course, Singapore is the first country and only country right now in the world to have allowed the commercial sale of a cultivated meat product. That product is chicken, but I know there are some other cultivated seafood companies in Singapore that are aiming to launch in Singapore soon. And in our cultivated meat state of the industry report, we also covered this in our webinar last week, which is on our YouTube channel. We kind of go more in detail about the specific sort of paths to market for different countries for cultivated meat. So I won't go into too much detail here, but I will say I'm pretty confident that fair and transparent regulatory frameworks are on the way in several different countries. We can't say exactly when that's going to be, but I think it is on the way soon. And I know no countries want to, take their time to make sure that there's consumer confidence in the product and everything like that. So I think it should be on the way soon. Another regulatory challenge that we've seen in the United States and in Europe is these label censorship laws. So laws that kind of regulate if you're able to say meat or seafood or dairy on an alternative protein product. Some of these laws apply to seafood, some of them don't. So again, kind of more details in our other sort of webinars and resources. But yeah, I think most of the same kind of regulatory challenges and opportunities that apply to other alternative protein products also applied to seafood. I don't know if there's anything sort of extra there, unless there's anything anyone else would like to add.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. I'll also just add, for those of you who aren't aware, in the US, cultivated meat will be regulated by the USDA and the FDA. But cultivated seafood, except for cultivated catfish, will be just regulated by the FDA in the US.
Great. And another question here that's just a follow-up to our talent question earlier, asking about established professionals, maybe on the business side. This is a question we get a lot. I know we talk a lot about sort of career pathways for science professionals, but there's definitely a need for business-related, in roles like business development, sales, marketing, strategy and operations, all of that stuff. So definitely still a need there if you're a little later on and have maybe transferable skills to this industry. So again, a plug to check out GFI's career resources, because we do have a job board. And I know some of the companies that have just started raising larger rounds this year and last year are starting to get more into the swing of hiring for some of those business roles. So definitely a lot of opportunity there this year. Okay, next question here is, how well do you think consumers understand what plant-based seafood is? And a comment that plant-based meat has come a long way, potentially because of food service deals that have made it sort of high profile. I know GFI did some alternative protein or alternative seafood consumer research last year. So Marika, maybe if you want to touch a little bit on that and the findings of that research.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, plant-based meat didn't really, has always been around. We've had veggie burgers and products catering to vegans and vegetarians for many years. But it wasn't really until we had some of the larger companies like Beyond and Impossible start producing products that were really designed to mimic the exact sensory experience of consuming the conventional version of those products. And then with, their ability to scale and find their way into a lot of retail and food service operations around the world has been huge for the entire plant-based meat industry. So we don't yet have a kind of impossible of plant-based seafood. We have a lot of really amazing startups and companies that are producing awesome products, but none that have kind of gotten to the point yet where they're a household name the way Impossible and Beyond are. And we can see that with when we do have that, there'll be more consumer trust. Folks will have a better idea of what to expect when they're eating a plant-based seafood product. So that will be really helpful. So just continuing to support a lot of the really spectacular startups in this space is a priority of ours. As I mentioned, in terms of consumer perception, one of the leading barriers to consumers trying or consuming plant-based seafood is perceived taste and texture. They're not sure if it's going to taste good. They're not sure if the texture is going to be on point. And then with cultivated seafood, the leading hypothetical barriers, because there are no products on the market yet, are also taste and texture. So we see opportunities to really market for marketing to be really focused on taste and texture. Yeah, and I think we did paste our consumer research in the chat earlier, but I'll do so again.
And to piggyback on that real quick, Marika, so one of the great things about the current plant-based meat product portfolio is that most consumers who try it say they would eat it again. So 90% of consumers who try a plant-based meat product want to eat it again. So replicating that sort of initial interest in plant-based seafood or other alternative seafood products, and then also delivering on the taste and texture is going to be critical to increase adoption for the category.
Awesome. Thank you, Em. And I'm realizing, thank you all for the questions. We are 2 minutes over time. So we're going to hop into our networking session. I'm going to paste a link to that. If you haven't registered, it's not too late. We really appreciate all of you joining, all of your thoughtful questions, and thanks to my fellow GFIers for being here. Have a good one. See you in the networking session.
Thank you all. See you soon.